Hi there. Facebook's unveiling of a new digital currency, Libra, has produced a tidal wave of skeptical, critical, and outright hostile responses. Last week, the U.S. Congress requested a moratorium on Facebook's Libra stablecoin. So what exactly does Libra mean, and how does it work? What will be its impact on the existing financial system? And is it yet another great innovation for human society, or a Pandora's box that has great uncertainty? To discuss these questions and more, I'm happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Hu Naijin, Associate Professor at the School of Public Policy and Management at the University of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and Anna Tangen, our current affairs commentator. We shall also speak to Vox Day via Skype, Chief Content Officer of unauthorized TV in Italy. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. My question is very, very simple. So what exactly is Libra?
Well, in my opinion, Libra is, also we can see the title of this is a kind of new digital currency. But in my opinion, it is different from the last generation of digital currency, which is Bitcoins. Because Libra has, I think, just two things behind it. One is an association called Libra Association. Not only Facebook is involved, but also other, I think, 26 big companies such as MasterCard, Visa, ePay, PayPal, all etc., etc. So many companies behind this association. And secondly, I think if it is put into reality, there will be a kind of reserve behind this, a basket of, I think, currency basket, I think, including every major kind of currency. So I think it is a kind of, if we want to make comparisons, I want to make it comparison to the SDR, special drawing rights.
I was about to mention this. Zhou Xiaocheng, a former top banker, suggested that we use a currency above the sovereignty of a nation state following the financial meltdown that took place in 2008. And do you think Libra could be compared in parallel to special drawing rights of IMF?
No. To put it like that, I mean, people, if you're watching this, you should know that this will never happen. And the reason is very simple. Libra would replace currencies. And this would have a drastic effect on economies to manage their economies. Remember, every time there's a recession, what do people do? They start to play with their currencies. They start to create fiat and things like this. Libra would put an end to that. They would, in essence, they would have to buy currencies. There would be no order. The U.S. in particular would be very much harmed by this, because this would put an end to the petrodollar hegemony. In essence, the SWIFT system, which has controlled the world since 1973, would be over. So when they say put a moratorium on it, when the report comes back, it's going to be very simple. No. And no other country, except maybe some small small country in the Caribbean, will allow it to happen. But it won't be allowed to trade internationally, because you're putting in the hands of a non-state actor, right, one of the most powerful tools in the world. In essence, it would be like asking every country to give up a bit of their sovereignty to some for-profit entity which has proven time and time again not only unreliable, but dishonest.
The end of the Cold War saw the rise of non-state actors one after another. Some are very good, some very bad, such as Al-Qaeda, very bad terrorist organization. They are also non-state players. Let me go to Mr. Vox Day. Do you think the use of, say, the use of Libra is part of a process to decentralize banks, and therefore it could serve to level the playing field, and could, ironically, it could be blessing for underdeveloped countries? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that, with all due respect to the previous commenter, I think that Libra is not correctly understood by most economists, because you can't understand Libra until you understand that Facebook is and has always been a tool of the U.S. government. You know, they like to talk about Peter Thiel doing the investment, but they ignore the fact that there was a 25 times larger investment by a party that was directly connected to the Information Awareness Office. And so what I see Libra as is an attempt. It was James something or other. I can't remember his name, but you can look it up. It was the investment was 25 times larger than Peter Thiel's investment, and it was at the same time in the same year. But you never hear them talk about that. And when you look at what Libra is designed to do, Libra is designed to provide competition for the non-government controlled cyber currencies. You know, the US government always likes to try to compete with itself. And so it's kind of like Canon coming out with a new laser jet, or HP coming out with a new laser jet that competes effectively with its existing popular brand. They would rather compete with themselves than with other people. I strongly suspect that Libra is designed to do that. So it's not something that would ever be a rival to the petrodollar. I think it's something that would end up linked to the petrodollar in some manner. You know, I'm from the game industry, and there's a very sizable economy in currencies that are virtual, just within the games themselves, you know, when you're buying in virtual products. And because Facebook has a fairly strong gaming component and a fairly strong economies within its ecosystem, you know, that gives them a fairly formidable base to start with. And so I just wouldn't be too terribly surprised if the U.S. surprises everyone and endorses Libra.
Yeah, I would like to point out that if, in fact, this gentleman had 25 times what Peter Thiel did, he would be on the world's richest list. And I have no idea still who this person is. I guess we'll have to look it up. But I think this is a very different view of it. Obviously, there can be many views of something, but I don't know if this is very mainstream. They have come out and said that this would have to be a basket of currencies, that it would have to represent the buying power of each entity in each country. So if you're buying in pound, if you're in England, you're doing pounds, you would be, the basket would reflect the purchase of pounds. So I don't know exactly how this would be somehow part of a dark web being spun by the United States. That would be very, very hard to believe. They already have an existing monopoly. I think this is a direct threat, so I'd have to disagree with my learned colleague.
Nigel, earlier I spoke of the use of Libra for those in underdeveloped countries to benefit those who cannot have equal access to the financial services, I mean global financial services. Do you think this is a blessing for the poor, and this is a part of the campaign to live and let live?
Well, I agree. I agree with this gentleman. One point of view is that if we want to put Libra into reality, into real world, and there are so many difficulties and questions we have to face. Yes, we have mentioned SWIFT. We have also mentioned IMF. We have mentioned SDR. We do not have to mention political, military, economic institutions. There are so many formal institutions to make sure the current systems works. But as to Libra, there's no such things as this. So I think if we want to, such as you have mentioned, to make the poor countries' people to use Libra to replace the current currencies, there are so many things we have to do. We have to establish some kind of formal institutions to make sure Libra can work. And this cost of this establishment of all these institutions will be on the poor countries' people themselves. They have to pay more taxes, they have to pay more money, they have to pay some kind of transaction fees.
So the use of Libra should be institutionalized.
Yes, that's right.
As part of the global governance.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be Libra. Each country is, in essence, going to have their own electronic currency, which can replace their cash or be in addition to cash. You're already seeing this in India. Doesn't everyone ever wonder why they had this this demonetization, where they took out bills that were not worth very much by anyone's standards, and even it said you have to turn those in and get it. This is to push people towards eventually an electronic currency. Why? It's in the interests of governments, because you can tax at the point of transaction. There's no, I'll pay the government next time or anything like that. When the transaction happens, it's taxed. And this would be a huge boon to India, where they have very, very low tax compliance.
And do you gentlemen think that given the sizable following of up to 2.7 billion users of Facebook around the world, Zuckerberg is able to bypass all the central banking authorities' hence the reason for the U.S. Congress to pause the development of Libra?
Well, in my opinion, I think from the technology's point of view, the difficulties may not that be huge. I think it reminds me of Mr. Ma Huateng's very famous speech. I think Ma Huateng is...
He's the founder of
the Tencent payment, yes. He said that the technology is not that difficult, but the political, the supervision, the regulation behind it are very huge. So I think, yes, we have to persuade a lot of institutions, countries, etc., to establish a cool system behind it. So I think if we want to use money to measure technology, it's relatively simple. But if you want to make money to measure a kind of history, you have to pay even more than you can imagine to establish a new system.
I mean, from a legal point of view, this is a non-starter from a regulation. The truth is, right now, this is a new field, and it's very loose. Governments are taking a look at it. But the one thing is for certain, that they're going to regulate it. They're not going to allow currency controls to go beyond their borders. Can you imagine what would happen in countries around the world? You'd have money flowing around anonymously.
This is anarchical.
It's pure anarchy. So I think it's interesting that we're talking about it, but it's a non-starter.
Let me go back to Vox. What do you think of the use of Libra on and its impact on global governance? We were talking about anarchical chaos. Do you think this will be a nightmare for the U.S. Federal Reserve, for example?
Not necessarily. You know, the earlier commenter who just mentioned about how this would be very disrespectful of national sovereignty, and he's absolutely correct to say that. But we've also seen that the big social media companies are essentially disrespectful of national sovereignty. They have no respect for it whatsoever. We see that with regards to their behavior with taxation. We see that with regards to.
But we have set up the firewalls. We could prevent this from happening in our country.
Yes, certainly. Any country could, but the reality is that only the larger countries that are already, capable of being independent of big social, Russia, China, India. I personally see Libra as connected to the desire of the big social companies to control and dictate the politics of the West. Google has come right out and said that they're going to try to influence the 2020 election in the U.S. because they failed to do so in 2016. When there's tens of thousands of people who have been deplatformed and demonetized on various platforms, myself included on
Vox, how will this amount of money be managed, and where do you think the trust of it comes from?
Where do I think the what of it comes from?
The trust.
Well, the trust is going to come from the Facebook user base. I mean, they're already accustomed to using virtual currency.
And you disagree, right?
Games like World of Warcraft.
This is a stable coin. This is not like Bitcoin. Bitcoin is not backed by anything. It costs a lot of money in terms of energy to create, and it's basically, you need to do the mining in order to keep the platform running, because all the transactions have to be basically brought up to date. This is a stable coin. This means that it is backed. That is not the problem with it. And so, if you believe that they're buying the currency, and obviously they would, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. It's never going to happen. So I don't know exactly why we'd get into the details. Now, can this structure be used in other ways? Yes. There are some very interesting things that are being done in terms of large-scale, like heavy airplanes, things like this. If you want to finance them, there are different ways that you can use these things. Basically, in lieu of an equity startup. It's just more efficient than going through red herrings and all these types of things. That would be part of a bond or a stock market, and you can diversify your distribution because you can use the internet. But this is going way beyond that. This is literally, Facebook would own a good chunk of the world, and it's not a question of disrespect to sovereign issues. It's that none of these nations are going to give this up.
The U.S. Congress has moved to pause the development, as I said earlier, but what was the immediate response from China? Now, at the latest summer Davos forum, Zhu Min, former vice president of IMF, said Libra could be a threat to our financial institutions. Do you agree?
Well, from the long-term point of view, that we have to say, here in China, we have to set up a new system of digital currency, which is also the trend of the future, I think. But from short run point of view, I think we do not have to fear so much about digital currency, because on the one hand, we do not have any access to Facebook here in China. On the other, I think we have strict regulations of finance sectors. And I think as to China, the blockchains is still under study. We do not have anything put into reality in blockchains, based on blockchains. So I think from short run point of view, we do not have to worry so much about that. But in the long terms of point of view, we have to study something, we have to do something, we have to prepare something.
And given the limited size of Bitcoin, how different is Libra from this cryptocurrency?
Well, there's this anonymous factor. I think Libra is promising that to a certain extent. But, you know, it's the whole point about Bitcoin was it was invented so people couldn't trace transactions. That's the whole thing here. I mean, if you wanted to create a digital currency, you could have done that. It would have been fine. But Bitcoin has been used in nefarious ways. People use it for drugs, white slavery, evading taxes, very dodgy deals, you know, involving arms and things like this. So it's not something that any country, either individually or collectively, can endorse, because it just basically hides everything. There's no transparency. Everyone around the world, you know, everyone criticizes everyone. Oh, you're not transparent enough, and then they come up with Bitcoin completely. So once again, the Libra is a stable coin, and that means that it's backed. It's not thin air. When you buy something for 1 yuan or $1 or one things, right, they buy a currency.
Yes.
All right. So it's a one-to-one, but it's a way of transacting that goes beyond the scope of where governments can control it. And this is where the non-starter begins.
Let me go back to Vox. One of the major reasons for the United Kingdom to have a Brexit from the European Union is Brighton's disagree with Brussels about, for example, monetary union, currency union. Today we are talking about, say, Libra that would bypass central banks, that would make sovereign currencies useless. So what do you think of the future of currencies based on national sovereignty? We see the rise of populism that disagrees about the regional economic integration like a monetary union. Do you think a stable coin like Libra would help bypass this obstacle in the next stage of globalization?
I'm sorry, I'm afraid I couldn't hear the question very clearly. It wasn't coming through.
Anna.
But to respond,
yes,
to respond briefly to what some of the other gentlemen were talking about, again, I don't think that this discussion is hypothetical, because what we think is possible and what we think is viable, it tends to be largely irrelevant when it comes to technology. You know, there's the famous example of Bill Gates saying 640K was all anybody would ever need. You know, if this is just another attempt to create another digital currency, and Facebook is just doing it because they want to get in on the rush, then I would tend to agree that it's not necessarily likely to succeed or be successfully introduced. But as I said, I believe that Libra is first and foremost designed to be a U.S. government-approved competitor to Bitcoin for the very reasons that the commenter mentioned. And so I strongly suspect that it will happen, and it will be something that the various governments of the world are going to have to deal with, because, again, it's important to remember Facebook doesn't need any approval to create a virtual currency that works within its own ecosystem. And they've got enough.
Well, I haven't
viable.
practiced law in a while, but I am still a lawyer, and I would tell you that you're absolutely wrong. Every sovereign nation can regulate whatever activity they want, and if they decide it's in the best interest of their country to have a firewall or to tell Facebook that they can't be in the country or they cannot have this form of exchange, they can do that, absolutely. And I have no idea where you get this idea that they can go above and beyond the sovereign nations that they're doing business in. Quite the opposite. They're facing increasing regulatory constraint as they are facing increasing fines for ignoring the current laws that are in effect.
Let me go back to my initial question, Vox. Let me insist that I'm so interested in the issue of Brexit because it has so much to do with monetary union. The UK government doesn't favor this idea that British sterling should be part of, should be eliminated. It should evaporate. They should instead adopt the euro. And today we'll talk about Libra. Libra means an important part of globalization in terms of monetary union. But that disagrees with either the Trump administration or will be adopted by the populist government in the UK. Neither will it be adopted in Brazil, where a populist leader is also elected into office. So what do you think of the global implications of Libra in this context of a rising populism?
Is that directed at me?
Yes, of course, Vox. You seem to be absent-minded.
Oh, okay. No, I was having some trouble here. I was having some trouble hearing for a second. Anyhow, it's not going. I mean, the thing that's important to understand here is that I don't think that people are going to accept it on a conscious, cognizant level. I don't think you're going to have a big debate about people saying, "Oh yes, Libra sounds great." Facebook is going to try to bring it in the same way that a virtual currency is introduced in a popular game like World of Warcraft. They can get to a point where it becomes a substantial unit of exchange without needing to get approval from anybody. Without, yes, things can be blocked and stuff, but I don't think that most people understand how much of an economy there is in things like mining Warcraft gold and so forth. And Facebook is much, much bigger than that. If you look at, you had companies like Zynga that had massive valuations on the stock market only based on their Facebook players. And so I think that it's very important to look at the situation from what Facebook can do without needing to go outside of Facebook before they push.
Nigel, how do you respond to his comments on Facebook?
Well, I actually agree with you on the sovereignty issue, that any kind of sovereignty will regulate any kind of currency that is related to the particular country, whether it is flow in or it is flows out. As to Libra's, I think, popularity around the world, I think it is also very difficult for so many people to have consensus on one point of view. And so I think before Libra can be worldwide popular, each country may develop their own kind of system on the digital currency beforehand. So I think as to this gentleman's comments about Facebook's intention, I'm afraid, yes, Facebook can earn money through this kind of Libra, but Facebook will not change the current system, will not change the formal institutions. According to my information, I think Facebook will charge some kind of transaction fees in the future of Libra. Yes, they can earn so much money, but they can't influence the real world, especially in politics and in economic systems.
Let's look at how countries in the Middle East will respond to the use of Libra. Now, since the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, and US dollars were delinked with gold, then OPEC countries made US dollar the only currency for oil trade settlement. Yet, With the rise of new energy, the weight of oil is also decreasing. In this context, and with the incomparable user numbers of Facebook up to 2.7 billion, do you think Libra could be the next way of U.S. long-arm jurisdiction?
Well, I'm going to say once again, it's not going to go forward. The oil situation is being exacerbated by the fact that the oil market moved. The U.S. was the greatest user of oil at that time. Now the U.S. is actually one of the greatest producers of oil, and they're in essence self-sufficient. So this idea of a petrodollar has basically evaporated. There's no reason to keep it going. And if the U.S., other than the fact that everything is in place, if the U.S. keeps pushing on this SWIFT and basically weaponizing it against not only China, but everybody in the world. They've said, if you don't do what we want, we're going to use our currency system against you. And this is the essence of all of the embargoes that they put on these different countries. They back it up with SWIFT. It was agreed when SWIFT was created that it would never be politicized, that it would never be weaponized. Now, that has passed. Now you're seeing countries go out. So this is a separate question from this issue. These 2.7 billion people, that's great. You know, they're buying things. And in the instance of our friend here from the United States, he's saying that, you know, there's a big economy in games. Yes, there is. But this is virtual things in a virtual world for virtual, you know, real money for virtual things in a virtual world. It's a closed-end system. What happens there does not affect economies. It is just a game. There's a lot of money involved, but it's not necessarily going to change anything. So when you start looking at Libra, yes, there are going to be attempts to do this, and where it is compatible with national interest, it will be allowed. But to the extent that it takes away from the crucial national interests of any country, it's not going to be allowed, and there's no way you can impose it on that country.
Najim, the last question is very much about the rhetoric. Yes, Vox.
Well, don't you see the connection between the weaponization of SWIFT, which I agree with you on, and the way that Libra can be used in an even more effective manner?
Yes, if all nations agree to it and the U.S. agree to it, of course, it would become an international virtual currency. But the whole point is not all nations are going to agree with it, and especially not the U.S. It would destroy our balance of the interest that we pay would double or triple on our national debt. It would cripple our country. It would cripple the world's economy because the U.S. is such an important part of the consumption. So I don't, you know, I know you have a sense that there's some paranoia about the U.S. using this. I have yet to hear from you anything substantial to back that up.
The issue, by the end of the day, is whether China will create its own currency system, will create its own SWIFT system to bypass the financial sanctions. And that could be, that will depend on whether the U.S. government is ready to launch a financial war against China in the next stage of our competition. With that, we come to the end of today's dialogue. Thank you for being with us. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.